Hello, BookTube, it's Amy, and you're hearing my splendid voice again. We're doing something a little bit different today. I've been trying my hand at writing a few chapters of a book of personal essays of sorts about my reading and book collecting experiences. If you follow this channel, you'll know that I do love to read other people's works of that sort. And so I've got an outline of different topics I'd like to touch on. But I thought I would begin here with one that I've written on J.M. Barrie. And I'll throw it out there, see how this works, see how it sounds as I read it aloud. It probably needs a little bit of polishing. But the intention eventually would be to have a collection of perhaps 13 to 15 chapters such as this, and to publish them perhaps in an ebook of some sort. But we'll see how this goes. I'm here today with one that I started writing on J.M. Barrie, one of my earliest well, I won't say earliest, but one of my earliest in the last decade collecting interests. One of the authors where things really got started in a little bit of a different direction as opposed to buying solely to read. Of course, I read J.M. Barrie as well. But this is where I started looking at, multiple copies of the same book, looking at illustrators. But I will not ramble on too far. Instead, I'm going to begin to read aloud what I've written here. So here it is, and it's untitled yet. Perhaps it will just be called J.M. Barrie or Beginnings of the Collection, something along those lines. It was in the basement of Black Squirrel Books in Ottawa, Ontario, where I found my first J.M. Barrie. The blue cloth and golden leaves on the spine of the 1891 U.S. printing of The Little Minister caught my eye in a stack of books on the floor, and I sat on a musty, threadbare chair to examine it. I was 23 years old, and I recognized Barrie as the author of a childhood favorite, Peter Pan. But until that moment, I had no idea that he wrote novels for an adult audience. And it would be several more weeks until I discovered his essays and plays. My second Barrie purchase was 2 volumes, My Lady Nicotine and When a Man Single, in green cloth, reprinted 1922 editions of Scribner's 1896 collected edition of Barrie's works, and the first authorized editions to be printed in North America. It was in these 2 volumes where I've made another discovery, unopened pages, which are not the same as uncut pages, which I originally called them. Unopened pages are still attached to each other at the foredge or in some cases the top of the book. John Carter tells us in his ABC for Book Collectors, an invaluable resource for any collector, that unopened means that the leaves of the book issued entirely untrimmed and therefore having the folding of its component sections still intact at the top and foredge, have not been severed from their neighbors with the paper knife. It must not be confused, as it often is, by Philistines with uncut. In my early YouTube videos, more than one commentator ensured I knew just how much of a Philistine I was. Uncut pages have not been trimmed along their edges and maintain the original margins of the paper. As a result, the book may have very wide or tall margins. You may also see differences in sizes, even amongst the same edition of a book, as a result of some copies being cut and bound or rebound, and some copies being left uncut. You are not likely to come across uncut books in recent publishing, or even in your 20th or late 19th century collecting. With the introduction of publisher's binding, custom bindings and the sizing down of margins became uncommon. For the reader that doesn't know, from the advent of printing up until the early 19th century, most books were sold to their readers unbound or in paper covers that allowed the buyer to have them bound to their taste. You will not see unopened pages in books you purchase new today either. No bookseller or publisher would dream of inconveniencing book buyers in that manner by selling them an unopened book. In traditional printing and bookbinding, large sheets of paper are printed with several pages of a book, and those sheets are then folded and bound. To read the book, those folds needed to be cut open. 2 centuries ago, you could settle the debate of who was and was not a real reader simply by sneaking into a person's library and pulling books from the shelves to see if the pages had been sliced open with a paper knife. If they had not, you could be certain the owner was not actually reading the books they proudly boasted of to their friends and acquaintances. If you buy enough books published in the early 20th or before that time, you will inevitably encounter a book with unopened pages. To open your pages, you will need a sharp knife that will cleanly and easily cut through the paper without too much drag. Drag will tear your pages. Soft paper will likely result in a ragged, deckled edge. You are bound to have accidents and spoil some pages as you learn how to apply the right pressure and what angle to hold your knife. Online, you will find all kinds of advice. Some say a butter knife is best, but I have found a blunt edge to be at times useless and at other times hazardous to the book. The wrong implement, and you will find yourself with jagged edges or even torn pages. Others recommend a single sheet of stiff paper or a bookmark be used in a sawing motion. Perhaps this works for some if the book they are dealing with has a certain kind of paper. In my experience, the thick, soft, aged paper I've come across is vulnerable to tearing with too much friction, and a sharp knife, gently drawn between the pages, will create the crispest cuts without damage. The last summer that my maternal grandfather was well, I went down to New York State to visit him, and he gifted me a plain black and stainless steel pocket knife that turned out to suit my needs well. At the Book Vault in Endicott, New York, in the summer of 2022, I purchased 3 slightly cocked, and there is a footnote here. The reader is likely to comment on the use of the word cocked, which in the context does not mean half-cock, cocked off, or anything distasteful in nature, but rather refers to a cocked spine, a condition often inflicted on a book through improper shelving, either on an angle, too tightly, or both, that results in a slanted spine that permanently tilts to one side and disfigures the symmetry of the book. End of footnote. I purchased 3 slightly cocked and water-damaged Ruskins in the Dana S. & Company Boston Illustrated Cabinet Edition with a spattering of unopened pages, and I asked to borrow a knife. From a desk drawer in the kitchen, I was given one to keep. If sharpened right, it may very well suit my reading needs all my life. Perhaps someday I will purchase a proper vintage paper knife, but for now, I am using Charlie's pocket knife. But this is a diversion from Barrie. In my collecting, I am used to diversions. In fact, I delight in those diversions. But perhaps my readers and listeners today do not. If you are collecting Barrie, there are a few things you must know, and there are a few blunders you should avoid. Most collectors starting out will want a copy of Peter Pan. You must know, however, that Peter Pan is not a single book, but rather 4 separate titles. The character of Peter Pan made his first appearance in 1902 in a book that is decidedly for adults, titled The Little White Bird. In a chapter where Captain W., our unnamed narrator, spins a bedtime story to young David. In 1906, the portion of the text from The Little White Bird dealing with Peter Pan was published under the title Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, and that was illustrated by Arthur Rackham. In these Peter Pans, there is no Neverland and there is no Wendy. Kensington Gardens is a place where children come to die, or in danger of freezing to death, or being set upon by fairies, and the story is more suitable to be adapted into a horror movie than a children's cartoon. If the collector is interested in the Peter Pan of the movies and popular culture, it is the play Peter Pan or the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up, first performed in 1904 and published in print, that they will be most interested in. The fourth Peter Pan title is the 1911 book Peter and Wendy, which takes the events and characters of the play and tells the story in prose. The first edition of Peter and Wendy was published by Hodder and Stoughton in London and is bound in green cloth with gilt. The first U.S. edition was published the same year by Charles Scribner's Son in New York. Both editions are bound in green cloth and include the illustrations of Francis Donkin Bedford. A copy of this first edition, if you are not too particular about wear, sunning, and book plates of previous owners, can be purchased for around 2,000 Canadian dollars. I do not have this amount of money to spare on a single book, and so do not own a copy of this edition. A first edition described as very good to fine would likely cost you between 4,000 and 9,500 Canadian dollars. Be wary of the so-called early editions of Peter Pan, or booksellers that throw the term first edition onto editions not published in 1911 by Hodder and Stoughton or Scribner in the United States. There are booksellers who will price any old early 20th century edition of Peter and Wendy or Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens at a high price, even with soiled boards, even if it is a pirated American edition, and even if the illustrations are by an unknown, simply because they see the editions published from that time period listed and selling for high prices. Do not buy these unless, of course, you are starting a collection of faded, dog-chewed children's books. If it is not something you would delight in showing to your friends and family and delight in spending an hour or two reading over, do not buy it. Some collectors, wealthy collectors with more income than I have in my middle-class pocketbook, will consider their collection complete with a first edition of the Peter Pans. Others will search out his Scottish novels, but there is more than one way to go about collecting Barrie. The first way is the traditional way, which I am not shy to admit is well beyond my means and talents in finding a deal. You can collect first editions of his most well-known works. This would mean finding and purchasing the following: The Little White Bird, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1902. Peter Pan and Wendy, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1911. Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1906. And Peter Pan, the play, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1904. And perhaps you might also like to have Odd-Locked Idols, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1888. A Window in Thrums, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1889. His novel The Little Minister, published by Hodder and Stoughton in 1891. And Tommy and Grizel, published by Hodder and Stoughton in 1900. Assembling a collection of first editions of these works is likely to require an investment in the tens of thousands of dollars. A second way is to pursue illustrated editions only. If you decide to collect Arthur Rackham editions, there are several different editions of his illustrated Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens that you will want to familiarize yourself with. There is the 1906 edition in green cloth, the edition in red cloth, and a special vellum edition signed by Rackham. Only 500 copies of the signed vellum edition were printed. If you are buying illustrated editions, you should know how many illustrations the particular edition should have. For example, the Arthur Rackham Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens should have 50 tipped-in plates, or illustrations as they sometimes are called. But beware of the print thief who cuts illustrations from books to sell individually as framed art. Beware also of the unscrupulous bookseller who finds a copy of a book missing illustrations and repairs it by tipping in pages from other editions or from facsimile without labeling the book as altered or repaired. Some collectors may not mind if they're made aware of it, but from an ethical standpoint, a seller that is altering books should always declare it. A third way, the approach that I have taken, is to purchase what I can, when I can, Well, weighing the cost of the book against its condition and against my desire to add that particular edition to my shelves. I do not own a first edition of Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens or of Peter and Wendy, and I probably never shall, but I do have a nice 1902 copy of The Little White Bird without the dust jacket. I have a Folio Society facsimile reprint of Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. And the gems of my Barrie shelf are the large 21 centimeter by 27 centimeter Admirable Crichton and Quality Street, illustrated by Hugh Thompson. I have bought what I can when I can. My collection at the time of writing is as follows, in no particular order other than the order in which I drew them off my shelf as I wrote this. Better Dead, published by George Allen and Unwin Limited, London, the 1925 printing. The Little White Bird, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1902. The Little Minister, published by Lovell, Corll and Company in New York in 1891, which appears to be an unauthorized edition. The Little Minister, published by Street and Smith Company in New York in 1891, also an unauthorized edition. Sentimental Tommy, published by Charles Scribner and Sons in New York in 1897. Tommy and Grizel, published by the Cop Clerk Company Limited in Toronto in 1900. The Admirable Crichton, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London, with illustrations by Hugh Thompson, containing no date, in blue cloth with gilt boards, approximately 16 centimeters by 21 centimeters. The Admirable Crichton, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1914, with illustrations by Hugh Thompson, in red cloth with gilt boards, approximately 21 centimeters by 27 centimeters. Quality Street, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1913, with illustrations by Hugh Thompson, in purple cloth with gilt boards, approximately 21 centimeters by 27 centimeters. Quality Street, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London, also in 1913, with illustrations by Hugh Thompson, in blue cloth with gilt lettering on the spine, approximately 16 centimeters by 21 centimeters tall. When a Man's Single, by Charles Scribner and Sons, published in New York in 1922. My Lady Nicotine, also published by Charles Scribner and Sons in New York in 1922. Margaret Ogilvy, Her Son, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1897. Echoes of the War, published by Charles Scribner and Sons in New York in 1919. The Greenwood Hat, published by Peter Davies in London in 1937. Letters of J.M. Barrie, published by Peter Davies in London in 1942. This is a posthumous publication. McConchie and J.M.B., published by Peter Davies in London in 1938, also a posthumous publication. Odd Looked Idols by H.M. Cadwell Company in New York, with no date, in green cloth with gilt and red and green botanical decorations. A Window and Thrums, published by Henry Altmus Company in Philadelphia, no date, in red cloth. Peter and Wendy and Margaret Ogilvy, published by Charles Scribner and Sons in New York in 1915. The Plays of J.M. Barrie, published by Hodder and Stoughton in London in 1933. Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens, published by the Folio Society in facsimile reprint. And the annotated Peter Pan Centennial Edition, published by W. W. Norton and Company in New York and London in 2011. If you collect Barrie, you also may find yourself pursuing his contemporaries. Robert Louis Stevenson is a suitable shelf companion in more ways than one. Stevenson was a fellow Victorian, and as the author of Treasure Island and Kidnapped, is considered a classic in the world of young people's literature. And if you choose to expand into the realm of correspondence, you will find Stevenson and Barrie, A Friendship in Letters, edited by Michael Saw and published in 2020, a valuable read and a sustainable bridge, or suitable bridge rather, between your collections on the bookshelf. And that is the end of that first piece on J.M. Barrie. I think it needs some polishing and some work, but I thought I would share it with you in its current state.